Sarah Johnson stood at the window of her Victorian-style home in Spokane's South Hill neighborhood, watching as the autumn leaves danced across her unkempt front yard. The once pristine garden, which she had tenderly maintained for over 3 decades, now lay in disarray, much like her life. Her delicate fingers traced the weathered window pane, feeling every imperfection that time had etched into its surface. 35 years. That's how long she had dedicated to supporting Michael Anderson's dreams. They had met in high school at Lewis and Clark, where Mike had been the ambitious student body president, and she the quiet girl who tutored him in chemistry. Their love story had seemed perfect then, the kind that small-town America celebrated, complete with a romantic proposal at the Riverfront Park Carousel and a wedding at St. John's Cathedral. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering how she had left everything behind. Her teaching career prospects, her family's century-old home in downtown Spokane, her own dreams of opening a small bookstore, all to support Mike's vision of becoming a successful real estate developer. "We'll build something amazing together," he had promised, his blue eyes sparkling with determination and charm. The early years had been challenging, but full of hope. They had started in a tiny apartment near Gonzaga University, where Sarah worked as an administrative assistant, while Mike pursued his business degree. Every evening, they would walk along the Centennial Trail, planning their future, dreaming about the family they would have, the empire they would build. She had believed in him completely, never questioning his decisions, even when he insisted they move to the South Hill neighborhood to maintain the right social connections. Their inability to conceive had come as a devastating blow. Sarah remembered the countless nights spent crying in their bathroom, the numerous fertility treatments, the hope that would build up each month only to come crashing down. When she was finally diagnosed with premature ovarian failure at 32, Mike's reaction had shattered her world even more than the diagnosis itself. "Adoption?" he had scoffed during one of their heated discussions in their pristine kitchen. "I didn't work this hard to have some stranger inherit everything I've built." His words had cut deeper than any physical wound could have, but Sarah had swallowed her pain, as she always did, and tried to focus on being the perfect wife in every other way. The grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from Mike's parents, chimed 3 times, pulling Sarah from her reverie. She glanced around the living room, taking in the expensive furniture that had once made her proud, but now felt like props in a play she no longer wanted to perform in. The room, like every other space in their house, had been meticulously decorated to project success and stability. Now it felt more like a museum of broken dreams. Sarah's attention was drawn to a small box of old photographs she had been sorting through earlier. On top lay a picture of her younger sister Emma, taken just months before she had run away. Emma's rebellious smile seemed to mock Sarah from across time. Her wild spirit had always been so different from Sarah's cautious nature. While Sarah had played by all the rules, married the right man and built the perfect life, Emma had questioned everything, challenged everyone, and ultimately chosen her own path, regardless of the consequences. The search for Emma had consumed Sarah for years. She had used every connection Mike had, called in every favor, hired private investigators. The pictures of Emma had appeared on local news stations, in newspapers, and on countless missing person posters throughout the Pacific Northwest. Sarah had never given up hope, even when their parents had passed away, unable to bear the weight of not knowing what had happened to their youngest daughter. When they finally found Emma, the truth had been more devastating than the uncertainty. Sarah's hands trembled as she quickly pushed those memories aside, unable to face them even now. Instead, she focused on the way the afternoon sun cast long shadows across her hardwood floors, creating patterns that reminded her of the maze her life had become. The sound of teenagers laughing outside caught her attention. Through the gauzy curtains, she could see a group of high school students pointing at her house as they walked past. She knew what they were saying, the same rumors that had been circulating around the neighborhood for months. The once pristine Anderson house had become the subject of local gossip, its unkempt appearance and reclusive owner fueling wild speculations among the younger residents. The Witch of South Hill, they called her now. This woman who had once been known for hosting the most elegant garden parties in the neighborhood. Sarah almost wanted to laugh at the irony. She had spent decades crafting the perfect image, being the impeccable corporate wife, only to end up as the neighborhood boogeyman. The The setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, a spectacular display that would have once inspired Sarah to grab her camera. Now she simply watched as another day faded into night, marking the passage of time in a life that felt suspended in limbo. The house creaked and settled around her, its aging bones seeming to mirror her own weariness. 35 years of marriage, of supporting someone else's dreams, of putting her own desires aside, all of it had led to this moment. Sarah Johnson, once the perfect corporate wife, now stood alone in a deteriorating house, surrounded by memories she couldn't escape and dreams she'd never pursued. As darkness fell over Spokane, she remained at the window, a silhouette against the dying light, unknowingly standing on the precipice of a change that would reshape her understanding of family, love, and second chances. The morning Sarah's life completely unraveled began like any other in the past 3 decades. She had prepared Mike's favorite breakfast, Eggs Benedict with perfectly hollandaise sauce, and laid out his Wall Street Journal beside the Spokane Business Journal. Everything was exactly as it had always been, until it wasn't. Mike hadn't come home the night before, but that wasn't unusual anymore. Ever since his health scare 6 months ago, he had thrown himself into his work with renewed vigor, often sleeping in his downtown office at the Anderson Development Building. Sarah had accepted this change, like she had accepted so many others over the years, with quiet resignation. The call came at 10:47 a.m. Sarah remembered the exact time because she had been watching the antique clock in her kitchen, wondering whether to wrap up Mike's breakfast or throw it away. When his name appeared on her phone screen, she felt the familiar flutter of hope that perhaps today would be different. Sarah. His voice was different, clinical, detached. "I need you to call James Peterson, their lawyer." Sarah's hand tightened around the phone as Mike continued, "He has the papers ready. I'm not coming home." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke, choking her. "What papers?" she asked, though deep down she already knew. The hollandaise sauce congealed on the untouched plate before her, its sunny yellow color suddenly offensive to her eyes. "Divorce papers, Sarah. It's time we both faced reality. You've been..." He paused and she could picture him adjusting his tie, a nervous habit he'd had since college. "You've been an obstacle to my growth. Rachel understands my vision, my drive. She's young. She can still give me..." "Rachel," Sarah interrupted, her voice barely a whisper. "Your secretary?" The same Rachel who had organized their 30th anniversary party just 5 years ago. The Rachel who had always brought Sarah's favorite coffee when she visited Mike's office. "Executive assistant," Mike corrected automatically, and in that simple correction, Sarah heard 35 years of marriage crumbling. "She's pregnant, Sarah. 3 months along. I'm going to have the family I always wanted." The words hit her like physical blows. Sarah sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her legs no longer able to support her. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see her neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, walking her dog, completely unaware that Sarah's world was imploding just feet away. "The heart attack," Sarah began, trying to make sense of the timeline. "When you were in the hospital, were you already..." "It made me realize life is too short to settle," Mike replied, his voice taking on the same tone he used in business negotiations. "You'll be taken care of course. The house is yours. Though you might want to consider selling it, it's far too big for one person. James will explain everything about the settlement." Sarah's gaze drifted to the refrigerator door, where a photo of them from last Christmas still hung. They had posed in front of the massive tree at the Davenport Hotel's annual holiday gala, both smiling. Had he been with Rachel then? Had they already been planning this? "I've already moved most of my things to the new condo," Mike continued, filling the silence with practical details that felt like sandpaper against her raw emotions. "Whatever's left, you can have James arrange for it to be shipped or donated." A sudden memory flashed through Sarah's mind. Mike holding her hand as they walked through this very house for the first time, pointing out where they would put the nursery, planning for a future that would never come. She remembered how he had kissed her in every room, claiming each space as their own, promising her a lifetime of happiness. All those years, Sarah finally spoke, her voice stronger than she expected. All those fertility treatments, the specialists, the prayers. Was I just a means to an end for you? The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "You should call James," Mike finally said. avoiding her question. "He'll take care of everything." The line went dead before Sarah could respond. She sat in the kitchen for hours, watching as the morning light shifted across the room, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. The breakfast she had prepared with such care sat untouched, a final offering to a marriage that had already been dead for longer than she had realized. Later that afternoon, as Sarah walked through the empty rooms of her house, she began to see everything differently. The expensive artwork they had collected over the years, all pieces Mike had chosen to impress the right people. The formal dining room where they had hosted countless business dinners, but had rarely shared intimate meals together. The unused nursery that had been converted into a home office, filled with leather-bound books neither of them had ever read. She ended up in their bedroom. No, her bedroom now, and opened the walk-in closet. Mike's remaining clothes hung there like empty shells, designer suits and custom-made shirts that had always seemed more like a uniform than personal choices. Sarah ran her fingers along the fabrics, remembering how she used to lay out his clothes each morning, thinking such gestures proved her love. As the sun set over the South Hill neighborhood, Sarah Johnson sat alone in her too large house, surrounded by the artifacts of a life she had thought was perfect. Outside, the teenagers who had taken to calling her a witch walked past again, their laughter carrying through the windows. But for the first time, Sarah didn't feel hurt by their taunts. Instead, she felt something unexpected stirring in her chest, not just grief or anger, but something that felt surprisingly like freedom. She didn't know it yet, but this ending would lead to a beginning she could never have imagined. Sometimes life's cruelest blows clear the path for its greatest gifts, though she wouldn't understand this truth until a young man named Noah Williams would appear on her doorstep, carrying a photograph and a question that would change everything. 2 years could feel like an eternity or a heartbeat, Sarah realized, as she watched the seasons change through her living room window. The manicured lawns of South Hill had completed their cycle 8 times since Mike's departure, from the crisp browns of fall to winter's pristine white, then to spring's tentative green and summer's lush abundance, only to begin again. The house around her had transformed too, though not in the way her neighbors would have preferred. The once immaculate garden had grown wild, with native plants reclaiming territory from the carefully cultivated roses Mike had insisted upon. The paint on the Victorian trim had begun to peel, creating patterns that reminded Sarah of old lace. Inside, dust gathered in corners that had once been obsessively cleaned, and furniture sat draped in sheets like silent ghosts of her previous life. Sarah had surprised everyone, including herself, by refusing to sell the house. James Peterson, their lawyer, had presented numerous attractive offers, each one accompanied by a carefully worded suggestion about downsizing and moving forward. But Sarah had declined them all, finding an unexpected comfort in the building's gradual decay. It matched her own transformation from the perfectly polished corporate wife to something more authentic, if less socially acceptable. The neighborhood children had created elaborate stories about her, each one more fantastic than the last. Sarah sometimes caught fragments of their whispered conversations as they hurried past her house. "The Witch of South Hill," they called her, sharing tales about mysterious lights in her windows and strange noises from her overgrown garden. Their parents, who had once invited her to every social gathering, now crossed the street to avoid uncomfortable encounters. On this particular spring morning, Sarah sat in her father's old armchair, the only piece of furniture she had salvaged from her childhood home, sorting through another box of family photographs. She had been working through the boxes methodically, one each day, as if excavating her own history layer by layer. The task had become a ritual of sorts, a way to reconnect with the person she had been before becoming Mrs. Michael Anderson. Her fingers brushed against a familiar envelope, and her heart stuttered in her chest. The photographs inside were the ones she had distributed during the search for Emma, her sister's bright smile frozen in time, unaware of what lay ahead. Sarah had spent years trying to understand why Emma had run away, why she had chosen such a difficult path. Now, with the wisdom of experience and loss, she was beginning to see things differently. "You were braver than me," Sarah whispered to Emma's image. "You saw the cage they were building around you and you flew away." She thought about her own gilded cage, how she had not only accepted it, but had helped build it, believing it was what she wanted. The morning light shifted, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. Sarah had developed a different relationship with time since her isolation began. Without the endless social obligations and charity committee meetings that had once filled her calendar, she had discovered a gentler rhythm to her days. She spent hours in the library, reading all the books she had never had time for before. She had taken up watercolor painting, covering the walls of her bedroom with landscapes that existed only in her imagination. Her phone rarely rang anymore. The society women who had once been her constant companions had gradually drifted away, their carefully worded messages becoming less frequent until they stopped altogether. The only regular calls came from James Peterson's office, dutifully informing her of financial matters and occasionally passing along news about Mike's new life. The last update had been 3 months ago. Mike and Rachel had welcomed their son, William Michael Anderson Jr. Sarah had listened to the news with a strange detachment, as if hearing about characters in a novel rather than her ex-husband's new family. She had politely declined the invitation to send a gift. Rising from the chair, Sarah moved through the quiet rooms of her house, touching furniture and walls as if reassuring herself of their solidity. In the kitchen, she prepared her morning tea in a chipped mug she had bought from a local artist at the Riverfront Park Craft Fair. The elegant bone china tea service she had once used sat gathering dust in a cabinet, another relic of her former life. Through the kitchen window, she could see Mrs. Thompson's grandson pointing at her house and whispering to his friends. Instead of shrinking away as she once would have, Sarah raised her mug in their direction, almost enjoying how quickly they scattered. There was a certain freedom in being the neighborhood witch, she had discovered. No one expected anything from a witch, no social niceties, no polite pretenses, no exhausting maintenance of appearances. The doorbell hadn't rung in months, which was why the sound startled her so badly that she nearly dropped her mug. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen in her kitchen, wondering if she had imagined it. But then it came again, more insistent this time, accompanied by a knock that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. Sarah moved cautiously toward the front door, her heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. Through the stained glass panels, she could make out a figure on her porch, tall, young, male. Probably another real estate agent, she thought, or perhaps one of the local teenagers on a dare. She considered not answering, retreating back into the safety of her solitude. But something made her reach for the doorknob. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps loneliness, or perhaps the universe's gentle nudge toward the next chapter of her story. As her hand touched the cool brass, Sarah couldn't know that she was about to open the door to more than just an unexpected visitor. She was about to open the door to her future, to healing, and to a kind of love she had never expected to find. The young man on Sarah's porch stood with the awkward determination of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he wore a clean but well-worn jacket that seemed too heavy for the mild spring weather. In his hands he clutched a manila envelope with creased corners and water stains. "Mrs. Anderson?" he asked, then quickly corrected himself. "I mean, Ms. Johnson?" Sarah studied him through the partially opened door, noting how his fingers nervously traced the envelope's edges. There was something familiar about his features, something that tugged at her memory, like a half-forgotten dream. "I'm Noah Williams," he continued when she didn't immediately respond. "I need to talk to you about Emma Carter, your sister." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow, forcing her to grip the doorframe for support. In the past 2 years, no one had mentioned Emma's name to her. It had become another ghost in her life, haunting the edges of her consciousness, but never fully materializing. "How do you know about Emma?" Sarah's voice came out barely above a whisper. Noah shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing around as if ensuring they were alone. "Could I come in? It's complicated." Sarah hesitated. She hadn't invited anyone into her house since the divorce, preferring to maintain the boundary between her sanctuary and the outside world. But there was something in Noah's eyes, a mixture of hope and fear that seemed achingly familiar. "Come in," she found herself saying, stepping back to allow him entry. Noah walked into the foyer, his sneakers squeaking slightly on the hardwood floors. He looked around with undisguised curiosity, taking in the sheet-covered furniture and the dust motes, dancing in the streams of sunlight that filtered through the unwashed windows. Sarah led him to the kitchen, the only room she maintained with any regularity. "Would you like some tea?" she offered automatically, falling back on long-ingrained habits of hospitality. "No, thank you," Noah replied, carefully placing the envelope on the kitchen table. "I've been looking for you for a while, Ms. Johnson. I aged out of the system last month and they finally gave me access to my file." The kettle Sarah had been reaching for slipped from her grasp, clattering against the counter. "The system?" "The foster care system," Noah clarified, his fingers drumming nervously on the envelope. "I grew up in it, but I always knew. I hoped." He took a deep breath, seeming to gather his courage. "I have a photograph." He opened the envelope with trembling fingers and pulled out a worn photograph. Sarah recognized it immediately. It was one of the many copies she had distributed during the search for Emma. But this one was different. On the back, in Emma's distinctive handwriting, was a note: "My son's mother." Sarah's knees buckled, and she sank into a kitchen chair. "That's impossible," she whispered, even as her mind began connecting dots she had never seen before. "Emma never had a child. We would have known." Noah pulled out another photograph, this one showing a very pregnant Emma standing in front of what appeared to be a shelter. "She did," he said softly. "I was born at St. Anne's Home for Young Mothers in Portland. She left this photo with me when she—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "When she had to leave." Sarah's hand shook as she reached for the second photograph. Emma's face looked back at her, pale and tired, but with that same determined set to her jaw that Sarah remembered so well. She would have been 17, maybe 18 in the picture. "I always thought—" Noah's voice cracked slightly. "The way she wrote that note, I thought maybe you were my mother. That maybe you had asked Emma to help you hide the pregnancy or something. It happens sometimes, you know. But now, seeing you," he gestured helplessly, "you look so much like her. You're my aunt, aren't you?" The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Sarah stared at the young man sitting across from her. How had she not seen it immediately? He had Emma's eyes, their father's strong jawline, their mother's dark hair. He was family. The family she had longed for all these years appearing on her doorstep like a miracle. "Why didn't she tell me?" Sarah whispered, more to herself than to Noah. "I would have helped her. I would have—" "She left a letter," Noah interrupted, pulling out one final document from the envelope. "They gave it to me when I turned 18. She said she didn't want to burden you, that you had your own life, your own problems. She mentioned something about fertility treatments." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering those painful years of trying to conceive, of monthly disappointments and invasive procedures. All while her sister had been going through a pregnancy alone, thinking she couldn't turn to her own family for help. "She was protecting me," Sarah realized aloud. In her own way, she was trying to protect everyone. Opening her eyes, she looked at Noah, really looked at him, and saw not just Emma's son, but a young man who had grown up without the love of either mother or aunt. A young man who had been brave enough to search for answers, to show up on a stranger's doorstep with nothing but hope and a handful of photographs. "Would you like that tea now?" she asked softly, seeing how his hands trembled as he carefully returned the documents to their envelope. Noah looked up, surprise and relief washing over his features. "Yes," he said, managing a small smile. "Yes, I think I would." As Sarah rose to prepare the tea, she felt something shift inside her, like a key turning in a long rusted lock. The house around them suddenly felt less empty, less like a mausoleum to her past, and more like a space waiting to be filled with new life, new stories, new possibilities. The following weeks brought a gradual thaw to Sarah's frozen world. Noah's visits, initially tentative and filled with awkward silences, became more frequent and comfortable. They fell into a routine of sorts, meeting every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, sharing tea and pieces of their lives over Sarah's scratched kitchen table. Noah, she learned, had secured a job at a local coffee shop near Riverfront Park while taking night classes at Spokane Community College. He lived in a small studio apartment on the north side, carefully managing his limited savings from his time in the foster care system. Despite the hardships he'd faced, or perhaps because of them, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that reminded Sarah painfully of Emma. "I used to imagine what my family was like," Noah confessed one afternoon, helping Sarah clean years of dust from the living room windows. "In foster care, you create these elaborate fantasies about your real family, that they're secret agents or royalty in hiding, or something equally dramatic." He smiled self-consciously. wiping a particularly stubborn spot. "Never imagined I'd find my aunt living in a haunted house." Sarah looked up from the baseboard she was scrubbing. "Haunted house?" "That's what everyone at the coffee shop calls it," Noah explained, then quickly added, "Not that I believe those stories. Though you have to admit, the place did look pretty spooky when I first showed up." Sarah stood surveying the room they'd spent the afternoon cleaning. The sheets had been removed from the furniture. The windows now sparkled in the late afternoon sun, and the hardwood floors had regained some of their former luster. For the first time in 2 years, the house felt less like a tomb and more like a home. Maybe it was haunted, she mused, but not by ghosts. By memories, regrets, all the things I was too afraid to face. She picked up a framed photograph of Emma they'd found while cleaning. "I spent so many years trying to be perfect, the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, the perfect everything, that I forgot how to just be myself." Emma never had that problem. Noah moved closer, studying the photograph of his mother. What was she like? Really like, I mean. Beyond what the official reports say. Sarah sat on the newly uncovered sofa, patting the space beside her. She was incandescent. That's the best word I can think of. Emma lived every moment fully, never holding anything back. While I was trying to follow all the rules, she was questioning why the rules existed in the first place. Is that why she left? Noah's voice held a carefully controlled mix of curiosity and old pain. Sarah chose her words carefully, aware of how much weight they carried. Emma left because she felt trapped by the expectations everyone had for her. Our parents, though they loved us, had very specific ideas about how their daughters should live. I conformed, Emma refused. And then she found out she was pregnant with me, Noah added quietly. "If I had known," Sarah began, but Noah shook his head. "You can't change the past," he said, with a wisdom beyond his years. "Trust me, I spent enough time in therapy learning that lesson. What matters is now." As if to punctuate his words, a group of teenagers walked past the house, their voices carrying through the newly cleaned windows. But instead of their usual ghost stories, they were commenting on the changes they'd noticed. "Someone's actually fixing up the witch's house," one of them said, loud enough to be heard inside. Noah tensed, but Sarah surprised him by laughing. "Well, every witch needs an apprentice, don't you think?" The tension broke and Noah joined in her laughter. As their mirth subsided, Sarah found herself really looking at her nephew, seeing beyond the surface similarities to Emma and noticing the unique person he was becoming. His resilience, his capacity for forgiveness, his gentle humor, these were all uniquely Noah. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" she asked impulsively. "I'm not much of a cook anymore, but we could order from that Thai place down on Grand Boulevard." "I'd like that," Noah replied, then added with a mischievous grin, "as long as you don't make me eat any eye of newt or wing of bat." As they sat down to dinner that evening, sharing pad thai and spring rolls at the kitchen table, Sarah realized something had shifted. The house no longer felt too big, too empty. The memories that had haunted its corners seemed less oppressive, making room for new ones to form. They talked late into the night, sharing stories both painful and precious. Noah told her about his years in foster care, the good families and the not-so-good ones, the friends he'd made, the dreams he still harbored. Sarah shared memories of Emma that she'd kept locked away for years. Childhood adventures, teenage rebellions, the last conversation they'd had before Emma disappeared. When Noah finally stood to leave, the kitchen clock showed it was well past midnight. "Same time Thursday?" he asked, shrugging on his jacket. "I'll be here," Sarah promised, then added hesitantly, "I was thinking of cleaning out the guest room upstairs. It would be nice to have a proper place for you to stay if you ever wanted to." She let the offer hang in the air, not wanting to pressure him. Noah paused at the door, his expression thoughtful. "I'd like that," he said finally. "Maybe I could help with the cleaning this weekend." After he left, Sarah stood in her kitchen listening to the quiet sounds of her house settling for the night. But instead of the oppressive silence she'd grown used to, she heard possibility, the whisper of change, of healing, of family being rebuilt from the fragments of the past. Upstairs, the guest room waited, still filled with boxes of memories and discarded dreams. But now, for the first time in years, Sarah looked forward to sorting through them, to making space for something new, something real, something that felt, finally, like home. The transformation of the guest room became a weekend project that stretched into weeks. Each box they opened was like a time capsule, requiring careful sorting and often long conversations about the memories they contained. Noah proved to be surprisingly patient with the process, genuinely interested in the family history he was discovering piece by piece. "Who's this?" he asked one Saturday morning, holding up a faded photograph of a young couple standing in front of a small bookstore. Sarah took the picture, smiling at the memory. "Those are your grandparents, my parents, on the day they opened their bookstore downtown. It was called Carter's Corner Books. Your mother and I practically grew up in that shop." Noah sat cross-legged on the floor beside her, carefully adding the photograph to the keep pile they'd started. "What happened to it?" "Progress, according to the developers," Sarah replied, trying to keep the bitterness from her voice. "They tore down that whole block to build luxury condos about 15 years ago. The irony is, Mike's company was behind the development. I remember how proud he was of that project, never understanding why I couldn't share his enthusiasm." "Did you ever want to open your own bookstore?" Noah asked, his intuition surprising her once again. Sarah paused in her sorting, considering the question. "I did, actually. It was my dream when I was younger. I even had a business plan drafted. But then Mike and I got married, and his career took priority. He said it wasn't practical, that it wouldn't fit with our lifestyle. And now?" The question hung in the air, simple yet profound. Sarah looked around the half-cleared room, at the boxes still waiting to be sorted, at the fresh paint samples they'd taped to the walls. Now I'm learning that it's never too late to start over." As if to emphasize her words, a truck rumbled past the house, carrying supplies to the local hardware store where Sarah and Noah had become regular customers. The past month had seen them tackle various repair projects around the house, fixing leaky faucets, replacing broken window screens, repairing the creaky front porch steps. "You know," Noah said, pulling another box closer, "there's a vacant storefront on South Perry Street, the one next to the ice cream shop. I walk past it every day on my way to work. It used to be a florist, but it's been empty for months." Sarah looked at him sharply, caught off guard by the suggestion implicit in his words. "Noah, I'm just saying," he continued, pretending to be very interested in sorting through the box. "The neighborhood's really coming up. Lots of young families moving in. No bookstore for miles around. And you did mention wanting to do something meaningful with your settlement money." Before Sarah could respond, they heard the distinct sound of something hitting the front porch. Noah was on his feet immediately, protective instincts kicking in. "Stay here," he said, heading for the stairs. Sarah ignored his instruction, following him down to the first floor. Through the front window, they could see a group of teenagers running away, laughing. On the porch lay a small paper bag, smoking slightly. "Really? A flaming bag?" Noah said incredulously, opening the front door. "That's the best they could come up with?" Sarah couldn't help but laugh as Noah carefully disposed of the juvenile prank. "Well, if they're going to cast me as the neighborhood witch, they could at least be more creative about it. You know," Noah said, coming back inside, "we could always lean into it. Set up a cauldron on the porch, maybe add some dramatic lighting, give them something to really talk about. Or," Sarah countered, a spark of inspiration hitting her, "we could show them that change is possible. That people and houses can surprise you." The next few days saw them working with renewed energy. The guest room was finished first, painted in warm earth tones that Noah had chosen. They replaced the heavy Victorian curtains with light, modern panels that let in the spring sunshine. The old furniture was rearranged, creating a space that felt both comfortable and new. One evening, as they sat on the front porch, enjoying the sunset and planning their next project, Mrs. Thompson walked by with her dog. Instead of hurrying past as she usually did, she paused, taking in the improvements to the house. "The place is looking nice," she offered tentatively. "Those new flowers in the front bed, they're lovely." "Thank you," Sarah replied, surprised by the overture. "They're native wildflowers. Noah's idea, actually. Better for the local ecosystem." Mrs. Thompson's eyes moved to Noah, curiosity evident in her expression. Before she could ask, Sarah added, "My nephew. He's been helping me restore the house." "Nephew," Mrs. Thompson repeated, her confusion clear. The neighborhood gossip mill would be working overtime tonight, Sarah knew. "Emma's son," she said simply, feeling Noah's quiet support beside her. He found his way home. Later that night, after Noah had left for his apartment, though he was spending more and more nights in the newly finished guest room, Sarah sat in her father's old chair, thinking about the day's events. The conversation with Mrs. Thompson felt like another small step forward, another piece of her old life falling away to make room for the new. She pulled out her laptop, opening a fresh document. At the top, she typed, "Business plan, Carter's Corner Books, a new chapter." Then below it, she began to write, letting years of suppressed dreams flow onto the page. As she worked, she could almost hear Emma's voice, encouraging her to take this leap, to finally choose her own path. The house creaked and settled around her, but the sounds no longer seemed lonely. Instead, they felt like the comfortable noises of a home that was gradually coming back to life, much like its owner. Outside, the spring wind rustled through the wildflowers in the front garden, carrying the promise of new beginnings. The South Perry Street storefront stood empty, its large windows gathering dust, despite the vibrant neighborhood life surrounding it. Sarah and Noah stood on the sidewalk, studying the For Lease sign that had begun to fade in the summer sun. The ice cream shop next door was doing brisk business, families coming and going with dripping cones and happy chatter. "It's smaller than Carter's Corner Books was," Sarah mused, shielding her eyes to peer through the grimy windows. But maybe that's not a bad thing. More manageable for a fresh start. Noah pulled out his phone, scrolling through the photos he'd taken of the old bookstore from Sarah's family albums. "We could do something similar with the layout. Children's section in the back. Maybe add a small reading nook by the window." Sarah smiled at his use of "we," feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Over the past months, Noah had become not just family, but a true partner in her tentative steps toward rebuilding her life. The guest room was now officially his room, though he kept his apartment as a symbol of independence. "Mrs. Peterson called again this morning," Sarah said, turning away from the window to walk down the tree-lined street. "James wants to know if I'm sure about using part of the settlement money this way." "What did you tell her?" "That it's time I invested in my own dreams for a change." Sarah paused at a coffee cart, ordering their usual, an almond milk latte for herself and a double espresso for Noah. "Though I have to admit, the timing of Mike's latest news didn't help my confidence." Noah accepted his coffee with a frown. "You mean about the baby?" Sarah nodded. The birth announcement had appeared in the Spokesman Review Society pages 2 days ago. William Michael Anderson Jr. pictured with his beaming parents, Mike and Rachel. The photo showed them standing in front of Anderson Development's newest luxury high-rise, Mike's pride in his new family, evident in every line of his face. "I kept that clipping," Sarah admitted. "Not because I'm holding on to the past, but as a reminder. Every time I look at it, I see how much energy I wasted trying to be someone else's version of perfect." They walked in comfortable silence, sipping their coffee and watching the neighborhood come alive around them. South Perry Street had changed dramatically in recent years, transforming from a quiet residential area into a bustling district filled with indie shops and local eateries. It reminded Sarah of the old downtown where she'd grown up, before the big developers had moved in. "Look," Noah said suddenly, pointing across the street. A young mother was struggling with a stroller while trying to hold onto a squirming toddler who clutched a picture book. Without hesitation, Noah jogged over to help, steadying the stroller while the mother got her child situated. Sarah watched the interaction, noting how naturally Noah handled the situation. He had mentioned once that one of his better foster homes had included 3 younger children. He'd learned to be helpful early on. The mother was smiling now, thanking Noah as he pointed toward the storefront they'd just been examining. "Did you just tell her about the bookstore?" Sarah asked when he returned. "Maybe," Noah grinned. "She said there's nothing around here for kids to do on rainy days. Seems like a gap in the market, don't you think?" They turned back toward home, taking the long way through Manito Park. The Japanese garden was in full bloom, drawing photographers and peaceful seekers to its winding paths. Sarah remembered bringing Emma here when they were young, watching her sister feed the koi fish and make up stories about their underwater kingdoms. "I've been thinking," Noah said, as they sat on a bench overlooking the pond, "about Emma, about why she left me at the shelter." Sarah turned to him, hearing the careful control in his voice. They had discussed Emma often over the past months, but always dancing around this central pain. "She wrote in her letter that she wanted to give me my best chance," Noah continued, watching the fish swirl beneath the water's surface. For years I was angry about that. I thought my best chance would have been with my family. But now, seeing how trapped everyone was back then, you in your marriage, her with our grandparents' expectations, I'm starting to understand. She was trying to break the cycle, Sarah realized aloud. She didn't want you to grow up feeling as confined as we did. Maybe. Or maybe she was just scared and doing the best she could. Noah pulled out his wallet, removing a worn photograph, the one of Emma at the shelter. Either way, I think she'd be happy about this. About us finding each other, about the bookstore, about everything changing. A group of the neighborhood teens who had once tormented Sarah walked past their bench, but instead of their usual taunts, they waved. Noah had confronted them a few weeks ago, not with anger but with understanding, sharing stories of his own troubled youth and offering to help them set up a skateboard area in the park. The Witch's House had gradually become just another home on South Hill, its renovation a source of curiosity rather than fear. Everything does change, Sarah agreed, watching the teens disappear down the path. Sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. The trick is being brave enough to embrace it. They sat in companionable silence, watching the sun begin its descent behind the trees. The evening light painted the pond in shades of gold and pink, reflecting off the water like possibilities waiting to be grasped. I think we should do it, Sarah said finally. The bookstore, not just for us, but for Emma too, for the dreams she never got to pursue. Noah reached over and squeezed her hand. Carter's Corner Books, a new chapter. Actually, Sarah smiled, I was thinking of calling it Emma's Corner, a place where everyone can feel free to write their own story. The idea settled between them like a promise, as natural as the changing seasons. Above them, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, witnesses to another small step forward in their journey of healing and renewal. The lease agreement for the South Perry Street storefront lay on Sarah's kitchen table, its pages crisp and official, waiting for her signature. She sat staring at it, pen in hand, while Noah prepared dinner, a skill he'd been cultivating since moving in permanently last month. You know, he called from the stove, where he was stirring a pot of homemade marinara sauce. The paper won't sign itself. Sarah laughed, though it came out slightly shaky. I know, it's just... This makes it real. Once I sign, there's no going back. Isn't that the point? Noah turned down the heat and came to sit across from her. Besides, we've already ordered the first shipment of books. They'll need somewhere to go besides our living room. Our living room. The casual way he referred to their shared space still warmed Sarah's heart. The house had transformed over the summer, not just physically with its repairs and renovations, but emotionally. It had become a true home again, filled with laughter, occasional arguments, and the comfortable routines they'd developed together. I saw Rachel at the grocery store yesterday, Sarah said, finally picking up the pen. She was there with the baby. Noah's hand paused halfway to the salt shaker. How did that go? Better than I expected. She looked tired, happy, but tired. The baby was fussy, and she was trying to shop while pushing the stroller and checking her phone. Mike was calling about some business dinner. Sarah smiled slightly. I helped her reach the organic baby food on the top shelf. That must have been awkward. Actually, it wasn't. It felt like helping any other new mother. She's so young, Noah. Younger than I was when I married Mike. Looking at her, I could see myself at that age, so eager to prove myself to be perfect. Sarah signed her name with a flourish. I hope she figures it out sooner than I did. That perfection is overrated. Noah got up to check on his sauce. That it's better to be real. Sarah stood too, moving to help him set the table. Speaking of which, how are things going with that girl from your study group? Amy. Noah nearly dropped the plates he was holding, his cheeks coloring slightly. We're just friends. Sarah hummed knowingly. Friends who've been spending an awful lot of time at the coffee shop where you work. Friends who helped us paint the porch last weekend. Friends who... Okay, Noah interrupted, laughing. We might have talked about maybe going on an actual date. But with the bookstore opening coming up and my classes... Don't do that, Sarah said softly. Don't put your life on hold for other things. Trust me, I'm an expert at how that turns out. Their conversation was interrupted by the doorbell, an increasingly common occurrence these days. Sarah opened the front door to find Mrs. Thompson standing there with a casserole dish. "I made too much lasagna," she said by way of greeting. "Thought you two might enjoy some, what with all the work you're doing on the store." "Thank you." Sarah accepted the dish warmly. "Would you like to come in?" "Noah's just made his grandmother's marinara sauce recipe." Mrs. Thompson hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Well, I suppose George can handle feeding himself for one evening." As they settled around the kitchen table, Sarah marveled at how naturally it all felt. Sharing a meal with her nephew and her once judgmental neighbor, discussing plans for the bookstore's opening, laughing at Noah's stories from work. This was the kind of family she'd always wanted, but had never known how to create within the rigid constraints of her marriage. "The Historical Society is very interested in your plans for the children's reading program," Mrs. Thompson mentioned between bites. "Several members have grandchildren in the neighborhood, and that idea about featuring local authors. We're hoping to make it a real community space," Noah explained, serving more garlic bread. "Not just somewhere to buy books, but a place where people can connect. Like the old Carter's Corner books," Sarah added. "My parents' store was always full of people, reading, talking, sharing stories." "I remember that store," Mrs. Thompson said thoughtfully. "Such a shame when they tore down that whole block. The neighborhood lost something special then. But now we have a chance to bring some of that magic back," Noah said, his enthusiasm infectious. "Different location, different generation, same spirit." After Mrs. Thompson left, carrying promises to return for Sunday dinner next week, Sarah and Noah tackled the dishes together. Through the kitchen window, they could see the sunset painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "I've been thinking," Noah said, handing Sarah a plate to dry, "about the opening day for the store. What if we made it more than just a business launch? What if we made it a celebration of new beginnings?" "What did you have in mind?" "Well, the store's going to be called Emma's Corner, right? So what if we created a wall of stories? Not just books, but real stories from real people about their new beginnings. We could invite people to share their experiences of starting over, finding family, creating community." Sarah put down her dish towel, struck by the beauty of the idea. Her testament to second chances. "And third chances and fourth chances," Noah added, "whatever it takes to get it right." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the routine of washing and drying as natural as breathing. Outside, the neighborhood settled into evening, porch lights coming on one by one, families gathering for dinner, lives interconnecting in countless small ways. "You know what I think?" Sarah said finally, putting away the last dish. "I think Emma would love it. All of it. The store, the stories, the way everything's turned out." Noah smiled, that gentle expression that reminded her so much of her sister. "I think she knew it would happen this way. Maybe not the details, but the feeling of it. That's why she left those photographs, those clues. She believed in the power of family finding its way back together." Sarah looked around her kitchen, no longer a shrine to perfection but a lived-in, loved-in space, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. They were building something here, something real and lasting. Not just a business, not just a home, but a legacy of love that would ripple out into their community in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The renovation of the South Perry Street storefront was proceeding smoothly until the day they found the letter. Sarah had been supervising the installation of the custom bookshelves while Noah worked on the window display, when their contractor discovered something behind an old panel they were removing. "Ms. Johnson?" Carlos, their contractor, called from across the room. "You might want to see this." The envelope was yellowed with age, the paper brittle and delicate. Sarah's hands trembled as she carefully opened it, Noah peering over her shoulder. Inside was a letter dated 1985, written in a familiar handwriting that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. "That's Emma's handwriting," she whispered, sinking onto a nearby stepladder. Noah steadied her with a gentle hand on her shoulder as she began to read aloud. "Dear Sarah, if you're reading this, I guess you finally followed your dream. I always knew you would someday. I'm writing this in the empty storefront that I hope will become your bookstore." Sarah's voice broke as she realized what she was holding. A message from her sister, written during those missing months before they found her, when she was carrying Noah. "She was here," Sarah continued, her voice thick with emotion. "She spent time in this very space, imagining what it could become. Listen to this. I see it so clearly, sis. The shelves of books, the reading nook by the window, Children sprawled on cushions lost in stories. It's all waiting for you, whenever you're ready to break free. The construction workers had quietly moved to another part of the store, giving them privacy. Noah sat on the floor beside Sarah's stepladder, his own eyes glistening as he listened to his mother's words from the past. "There's more," Sarah said, turning the page. "I wish I could be there to see it happen, but I know I have to make different choices right now. Choices that hurt, but that I hope will lead to something better for everyone. Keep this space in your heart, Sarah. Keep it ready for when the time is right." The letter continued, describing Emma's hopes and fears, her dreams for her unborn child, her belief that someday, somehow, everything would come full circle. It was as if she had known even then that this space would eventually bring her sister and her son together. But the letter wasn't the only surprise the old building had in store for them. Later that afternoon, as they were processing the emotional discovery, Carlos approached them again, his expression concerned. "We've found some issues with the building's electrical system," he explained, showing them photographs from behind the walls. "The wiring is much older than we thought. It's going to need a complete overhaul before we can safely open." Sarah felt her stomach drop. The electrical upgrade hadn't been in their budget, and they'd already committed most of their funds to inventory and renovations. She looked at Noah, seeing her own worry reflected in his eyes. "How much?" she asked, though she already knew it would be more than they could easily manage. Carlos's estimate confirmed her fears. The work would cost nearly twice what they had left in their renovation budget, and without it, they couldn't get the final permits needed to open. "We'll figure it out," Noah said firmly, after Carlos had left for the day. They sat on the floor of what would be the children's section, surrounded by half-installed shelving and boxes of books. "Maybe I can pick up extra shifts at the coffee shop. Or we could do a crowdfunding campaign. The neighborhood's really behind us now." Sarah shook her head, pulling out her phone. "I need to make a call first." She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she hadn't used in over 2 years. Taking a deep breath, she pressed dial. "James Peterson's office," a familiar voice answered. "Helen, it's Sarah Johnson. I need to speak with James about accessing some of the investment accounts from the settlement." There was a pause on the other end. "Actually, Mrs. Johnson, Sarah, Mr. Peterson was hoping you'd call. He's been trying to reach you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong exactly, but there have been some developments regarding the Anderson Development Company that might affect your settlement. Mr. Peterson would like to meet with you as soon as possible." Noah watched as Sarah's expression shifted from concern to confusion. "I'll be there first thing tomorrow morning," she said finally, ending the call. "What was that about?" Noah asked. Sarah stood, brushing dust from her jeans. "I'm not sure, but I have a feeling our electrical problems might be the least of our worries." As if to emphasize her words, a loud crack of thunder shook the building. Through the front windows, they could see dark clouds gathering over Spokane, an unexpected storm rolling in from the west. "Should we head home?" Noah asked, eyeing the threatening sky. Sarah looked around the space, at the letter from Emma still resting on the stepladder, at the walls they'd painted in warm, welcoming colors, at the partially assembled shelves waiting to be filled with stories. Despite the new complications, she felt strangely calm. "No," she said firmly. "Let's stay and work a while longer. Whatever's coming, we'll face it together. That's what family does." They worked until dusk, the storm raging outside while they continued assembling shelves and unpacking books. Every now and then, Sarah would glance at Emma's letter, drawing strength from her sister's long-ago words. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. The conference room at Peterson and Associates felt exactly as Sarah remembered it, all polished mahogany and leather chairs designed to intimidate as much as impress. But Sarah wasn't the same woman who had sat here 2 years ago, quietly accepting the terms of her divorce settlement. James Peterson hadn't changed either, still projecting that careful mix of professional concern and paternal authority. He shuffled through papers on his desk while Sarah waited, Noah's supportive presence beside her, providing a strength she hadn't had during her last visit. "The situation is complicated," Peterson began, selecting his words with characteristic precision. "Anderson Development has been experiencing some financial difficulties. It seems Michael may have made some questionable investment decisions following his personal changes." Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. How does this affect the bookstore? Actually, Peterson's expression softened slightly. This might work in your favor. The property on South Perry Street. It's part of a portfolio that Anderson Development was planning to develop into luxury condominiums. The project has stalled due to these financial issues, and they're looking to divest certain assets quickly. Noah leaned forward. The whole block? Peterson nodded. Including your storefront and the adjacent properties. They're willing to sell at a significantly reduced price, especially to you, Sarah. It seems Michael is eager to avoid any public scrutiny of the company's finances. Sarah sat back, her mind racing. The settlement money she'd invested in stable, conservative funds, money Mike had always criticized her for not investing more aggressively, was now worth considerably more than his riskier ventures. How much? She asked. As Peterson named the figure, Sarah felt a smile tugging at her lips. It was well within her means, especially if she liquidated some of her safer investments. She could own not just the bookstore, but the entire block, protecting it from future development and preserving the neighborhood's character. There's one more thing, Peterson added, pulling out another document. In reviewing the original settlement, we discovered that Michael never disclosed certain assets, specifically a trust fund established by his parents for any future grandchildren. Noah shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but Peterson continued, "Given that you were married when this trust was established and considering recent developments," he glanced meaningfully at Noah, "there might be grounds to challenge the current beneficiary arrangement." "No," Sarah said firmly, surprising both Peterson and Noah. "William is Mike's son, and that money should be his. We're not going to fight over it." Peterson looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Sarah's expression stopped him. Instead, he pulled out the property contracts, spreading them across the table. Later, as they walked through Riverfront Park, Sarah and Noah discussed their next steps. The storm from the previous day had cleared, leaving the air fresh and clean, filled with possibilities. "Are you sure about the trust fund?" Noah asked, stopping to watch a group of children feeding the ducks. "It's a lot of money." Sarah joined him at the railing. "Money's just money. What we're building, our family, the bookstore, our place in the community, that's worth more than any trust fund." Noah smiled, that gentle expression that always reminded her of Emma. "Speaking of building things, I had an idea about the extra space we'll have next door to the bookstore." "Oh? What if we turned it into a community center, a place for study groups, literacy programs, maybe even a small cafe? We could call it Emma's Kitchen, combine books and food just like you and Mom grew up with." Sarah felt tears prickling at her corners of her eyes. "Noah Williams, when did you become so wise?" "Must be all those books you keep making me read," he teased, then grew serious. "I've been thinking a lot about what Mom wrote in that letter, about making choices that lead to something better for everyone. Maybe this is what she saw coming. Not just the bookstore, but a whole community space." They walked back toward South Perry Street, discussing plans and possibilities. The sidewalks were busy with afternoon shoppers, and several people waved or called out greetings as they passed. The neighborhood that had once whispered about the Witch of South Hill now embraced them as part of its fabric. As they approached the bookstore, Sarah noticed someone standing in front of the papered-over windows, peering in through a gap. Her steps faltered as she recognized Rachel Anderson, holding baby William in a carrier. "Sarah?" Rachel looked startled, then embarrassed. I heard you were opening a bookstore. I used to love the old Carter's Corner books when I was a kid. My mum would take me there for story time every Saturday." Sarah felt Noah tense beside her, but she stepped forward smiling. "We're planning to have story time too, Saturday mornings, just like the old days." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Mike's so angry about the property sale. He says you're trying to ruin him, but I remember how kind you always were to me, even when—" She trailed off, looking down at her sleeping son. "Would you like to come in?" Sarah offered, pulling out her keys. "We're still setting up, but I'd love to show you what we're planning for the children's section." As they led Rachel through the organized chaos of their renovation, Sarah watched the younger woman's face soften with wonder. She bounced William gently as they talked about board books and nursery rhymes, about the importance of reading to children, about creating spaces where families could grow together. "You should come to the opening," Noah said suddenly, surprising both women. "Bring William. Every kid should grow up with books." Rachel's smile was watery but genuine. "I'd like that." "Thank you," After she left, Sarah and Noah returned to their work, assembling more shelves and organizing the steadily arriving inventory. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like possibilities waiting to be grasped. "You know what?" Sarah said, pausing to read the spine of a children's book about second chances. "I think we're exactly where we're supposed to be." Noah looked up from the box he was unpacking, his expression thoughtful. "Mom would think so too." Outside, the South Perry Street neighborhood continued its daily rhythm, unaware that within the walls of the old storefront, a new chapter was being written, one of healing, of forgiveness, and of the endless possibilities that come with turning the page. The evening before Emma's Corner was set to open, Sarah stood in the center of the finished bookstore, absorbing the quiet anticipation that filled the space. The shelves gleamed with new books, their spines creating a rainbow of possibilities. The children's section, with its comfortable cushions and hand-painted murals of fantastic creatures, looked exactly as Emma had described in her letter. "The story wall is ready," Noah called from near the entrance, where he was putting the finishing touches on their most ambitious project. The wall, stretching from floor to ceiling, was covered with photographs, letters, and handwritten stories from community members, tales of new beginnings, second chances, and unexpected family connections. In the center of it all hung the photograph of Emma at St. Anne's home, her hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly. Beside it was the letter they'd found in the wall, preserved behind glass, its message of hope and possibility now shared with everyone who entered the store. "Amy did an amazing job with the cafe setup," Sarah commented, walking over to admire the small but welcoming space they'd carved out next to the reading area. Emma's kitchen, as they'd named it, was stocked with fresh pastries from a local bakery and coffee beans from the shop where Noah worked. "She's got a good eye for design," Noah agreed, his expression softening at the mention of his girlfriend. Over the past months, Amy had become an integral part of their lives, her practical optimism helping them through the final hurdles of opening the store. The bell above the door chimed, and Mrs. Thompson entered carrying a large basket covered with a checkered cloth. "I thought you might need some sustenance," she announced, setting the basket on the cafe counter. "You've both been working non-stop for days." The aroma of her famous cinnamon rolls filled the air as she unveiled the basket. "The Historical Society Board is very excited about tomorrow's opening," she continued, arranging the rolls on a display plate. "We've had quite a few calls about the local author's corner you're planning." Sarah smiled, remembering how the idea had evolved from a simple shelf to an entire section dedicated to Spokane writers. They'd already scheduled several reading events and writing workshops for the coming months. "Did you see who's on the guest list for tomorrow?" Noah asked, accepting a warm roll from Mrs. Thompson. "Nearly half the old South Hill neighborhood. Even some of those kids who used to call us the Witch House." "Well, you did help them build that skateboard ramp in the park," Mrs. Thompson pointed out. "And Sarah's garden workshop last month was very well received." Sarah looked out the window at their newly renovated block. The buildings that had once been slated for destruction now housed a diverse collection of local businesses, a fair trade coffee roaster, an artisan bakery, a small art gallery. The community had rallied around their vision of preserving the neighborhood's character while breathing new life into its spaces. "Rachel called earlier," Sarah said, sitting at one of the cafe tables. "She's definitely coming tomorrow with William. She said Mike, well, he's not happy about it, but he's not stopping her either." Noah joined her at the table, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking about something Mom wrote in that letter, about making choices that ripple out beyond ourselves. Look at everything that's happened because you chose to stay in that house, to face your pain instead of running from it." "Because we chose," Sarah corrected him gently. "Every step of this journey has been about both of us making choices together." Mrs. Thompson excused herself to head home, leaving them with the basket of rolls and promises to return early the next morning to help with the opening preparations. As the door closed behind her, Sarah and Noah continued their walk through the store, making final adjustments to displays and straightening already straight books. In the children's section, Sarah paused to admire the reading nook they'd created. The window seat was deep and comfortable, with cushions in soft, welcoming colors. Above it, they'd painted Emma's favorite quote, "Every story is a door waiting to be opened." "I found something else while organizing the last boxes from the house," Noah said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "I thought maybe we could add it to the story wall." Inside was a photograph Sarah hadn't seen in years. A teenage Emma and Sarah sitting in their parents' bookstore, surrounded by towering shelves and lost in their respective books. Their father had taken it one quiet Sunday afternoon, capturing a moment of perfect contentment between the sisters. "Perfect," Sarah whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. "This is exactly where it belongs." They added the photograph to the wall together, positioning it near Emma's letter. Standing back to admire their work, Sarah felt the familiar warmth of tears in her eyes. Not tears of sadness this time, but of gratitude for all the twists and turns that had led them to this moment. "Mom would love this," Noah said softly, putting his arm around Sarah's shoulders. "All of it. The store, the community center, the way everything's worked out? She does love it," Sarah replied with certainty. "She's been part of it from the beginning, guiding us here in her own way." Through the windows they could see the sun setting over South Perry Street, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Tomorrow, these quiet rooms would be filled with people, with conversation, with the rustle of pages being turned and stories being discovered. But for now, in these last peaceful moments before their dream became reality, Sarah and Noah simply stood together, surrounded by books and memories, ready to begin their next chapter. The morning of Emma's Corner's grand opening dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect early autumn day that made Spokane feel magical. Sarah stood on the sidewalk outside the store, watching the sun rise over the South Perry Street district, its golden light catching the new sign that hung proudly over the door, a simple design featuring an open book with pages transforming into birds in flight. "The first customers are already lining up," Noah called from the doorway, where a small group had indeed begun to gather. Among them, Sarah recognized faces from their old neighborhood, current community members, and even a few of the teenagers who had once spread ghost stories about her house. Inside, Amy was arranging the final displays in Emma's kitchen, the cafe already filling the store with the aroma of fresh coffee and baked goods. Mrs. Thompson supervised a group of Historical Society volunteers who were setting up chairs for the morning's events, while Carlos and his crew made last-minute adjustments to ensure everything was perfect. The bell above the door chimed continuously as more people arrived, families with excited children, local authors carrying their books, elderly residents who remembered the original Carter's Corner books. Each one paused at the story wall, reading the tales of transformation and connection that covered its surface. "Sarah," a familiar voice made her turn. Rachel stood there, baby William sleeping peacefully in his carrier. She looked nervous, but determined. "I brought something for the story wall, if that's okay." She handed Sarah a small envelope containing a photograph of herself as a child, sitting in the original Carter's Corner books. "My mom took this during one of your parents' story times. I wrote about how those Saturday mornings shaped my love of reading, and how I hope to share that same joy with William." Sarah hugged her impulsively, feeling the younger woman's surprise and then relief as she returned the embrace. "It's perfect," Sarah assured her. "This is exactly what Emma's Corner is meant to be, a place where all our stories connect." The official opening ceremony was simple but meaningful. Standing beside the story wall, Sarah shared Emma's letter with the gathered crowd, her voice strong and clear as she read her sister's long-ago words about dreams and possibilities. Noah spoke about the importance of community and second chances, his natural warmth and honesty touching everyone who listened. As the day progressed, the store filled with life and energy. Children sprawled on cushions in the reading nook, lost in new discoveries. Study groups claimed tables in Emma's kitchen, their discussions mixing with the general hum of conversation and the clink of coffee cups. Local authors chatted with readers, signing books and sharing stories. In a quiet moment between events, Sarah found herself back in the children's section, watching a young mother reading to her daughter. The scene brought back memories of similar moments with Emma, both of them curled up in their parents' store, discovering new worlds between the pages of books. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Noah appeared beside her, carrying 2 cups of coffee from Emma's kitchen. Sarah accepted one of the cups, breathing in its comforting aroma. "I was just thinking about circles. How life has this way of bringing us back to where we need to be, even if the path isn't what we expected. Like a good story," Noah agreed, watching as Amy organized a group of children for the first official story time. Speaking of which, I have something to tell you. I've been working on a book about Mom, about us, about finding family in unexpected places. Sarah turned to him, surprised and moved. Noah, that's wonderful. I thought maybe we could start a writing group here at the store, he continued. Help other people share their stories too. Amy's already offered to help coordinate it. Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Thompson hurried over. Sarah, dear, you need to see this. Someone rather unexpected just walked in. Sarah followed her gaze to the front of the store, where Mike Anderson stood awkwardly near the entrance, looking both out of place and vaguely uncomfortable in his expensive suit. Rachel was already moving toward him, William in her arms, her expression a mix of surprise and hope. Should I? Noah started to ask, but Sarah shook her head. No, it's okay. This is part of the story too. She walked over to her ex-husband, noting how the years had aged him, how the pressure of maintaining his image had left its mark. Welcome to Emma's Corner, she said simply. Mike looked around, taking in the warmth and life that filled the space. It's not what I expected, he admitted. When I heard you'd bought the block, I thought... He trailed off, seeming to realize how his assumptions might sound. It's exactly what it needs to be, Sarah replied. A place for new beginnings for all of us. As if to emphasize her words, William chose that moment to wake up, his happy gurgle drawing smiles from everyone nearby. Mike's face softened as he looked at his son, and for a moment Sarah saw a glimpse of the young man she'd fallen in love with so many years ago. Would you like to see the children's section? She offered. We have some wonderful board books that William might enjoy. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity, story times and author readings, coffee and conversations, old wounds healing and new connections forming. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows, the last customers reluctantly began to leave, each carrying books and memories of a remarkable day. Finally, it was just Sarah and Noah, sitting together in the reading nook that had once existed only in Emma's imagination. Through the window, they could see South Perry Street settling into evening, its streetlights coming on one by one like stars appearing in the darkening sky. You know what I keep thinking about? Noah said, breaking their comfortable silence. That first day I showed up on your porch, how scared I was that you'd turn me away. And now look at us. Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. Family has a way of finding itself, even when the path seems impossible. They sat together a while longer, surrounded by books and possibilities, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the city continued its eternal rhythm, but inside Emma's Corner, time seemed to stand still, holding them in a perfect moment of completion. As they finally rose to leave, Sarah paused by the story wall, her eyes drawn to the photograph of Emma that had started everything. In the fading light, her sister's smile seemed especially bright, as if she too was celebrating this moment of dreams fulfilled and family reunited. Ready to go home? Noah asked, holding the door. Sarah took one last look around the store, their dream, their story made real. Yes, she said, knowing that home now meant so much more than just a place. It meant family chosen and found. It meant new beginnings and second chances. It meant finally being exactly where she was meant to be.